Hello. So this series is about Terry Deary's Horrible Histories. Um, this was a set of books that has been, I think, decades in the making. Um, it is a children's series of books about different historical periods. When I was a kid, I had, I think, 5 of the Horrible Histories books, and I read them over and over and over and over again. I loved them. Could not get enough of them. So for me, this is a big nostalgia thing that I'm doing. As an adult, I have bought the blood-curdling box of books, which contains 20 Horrible Histories books. I've also got a couple of others that aren't in this set. One about Scotland, one about Wicked Words. I may acquire a couple more, but I'm going to be making videos about each of these books. Look forward to that. If you are a person of my generation, say, I don't know, late 20s to mid 40s maybe, and you grew up on the Scholastic Book Fair, and you loved history, you probably encountered the Horrible Histories series. There's now also a TV show of it that I may or may not watch. But yeah, love Horrible Histories. This is going to be pure nostalgia for me. In this video, we're going to talk about Groovy Greeks. This is one of my favorite of the Horrible Histories series. It's one that, not this copy, but I've had a copy of since childhood. As a kid, I read this one over and over and over again. And I actually reread it. I can't remember whether I read it when I was writing my dissertation or when I was transitioning my dissertation into a book. But I came back to Groovy Greeks at some point during the process of writing my dissertation / first book, because I was writing about adaptations, contemporary adaptations of Greek drama. And so I wanted sort of a refresher on what Terry Deary had to say about Greek drama. And actually, there's a bit in here, there's a particular cartoon, if I can find it very quickly, because I don't think I marked it. I don't think I folded down a page for it. This one right here. This comedy is tragic. I actually used that as a background on Facebook for a while. But there is a section in here on petrifying plays and electrifying epics. So there is a section that was very relevant to what I, as a scholar, am primarily interested in. Yeah, and I mean, it gives some basic information about, how Greek plays were probably staged. Nobody knows for sure today. We're not 100% sure. Scholars disagree over some elements of it. They agree on other elements of it. But, for instance, Deary gives this bulleted list. Greek theater always had the same scenery, was out in the open air, had no female actresses, only actors who also played the female parts, had no action on stage, only people talking about the exciting bits, murders and all that happened off stage. That's not 100% true, but it's close enough for most people's purposes. And in the major plays that people still sort of widely read and put on today, that is true. And had the actors wearing face masks and high platform shoes, so they moved around very slowly. That's true of tragedy. They wore something called a buskin, which I actually think is a Latin term. I don't think that's the Greek term for it, but I don't remember the Greek term for it off the top of my head. But they wore these very tall, basically they were sort of sandals that had a leather portion that sort of went up the leg, so sort of a sandal boot with a very thick sole. So it gave them height for the dignity of playing tragic characters. Comic actors, on the other hand, did not wear those. They wore these very soft-soled shoes, which were possibly more like a modern slipper or something like maybe a moccasin or the original Tom's Alpargatas, something like that. So they were much sort of they were lower to the ground. But anyway, so this is the kind of thing that Deary is always interested in with Horrible Histories, is telling readers this sort of information about the way that other cultures, historical periods, etc., functioned. And we sort of get that in a variety of ways. So one of the first sections, actually the first section after Deary's timeline, because he always includes a timeline, which is somewhat useful, although without context, some of the events, it's not always clear why they're important, but usually they get touched on later in the book. But we get a section on the gruesome gods, for instance. So, I mean, of course, mythology was a major component of Greek culture, ancient Greek culture. And he recounts the myth of the birth of Zeus and the overthrow of Kronos. We get sections on, for instance, the limits of democracy, which I actually find a very, very interesting and important one, because my current book project is about how contemporary adapters stage Greek democracy. And so one of the things that Deary points out is that, so I'll just read it to you, because the section itself, apart from the cartoon, is fairly short. Most countries today are run as democracies. That is to say, every adult has a vote on which laws are passed and how the government spends its money. Athens, being really groovy, had the first democracy, but because they still had a lot to learn, they didn't quite get it right. And then in the cartoon, everybody has a vote, except women, of course. No slaves will have the vote, of course. No poor people, of course. And no one under the age of 30, of course. Otherwise, everyone has a vote. So that's the progression. That's not wrong. But it does leave out some important contextual elements. So first off, in contemporary representative democracies, it's not really true that every adult has a vote on which laws are passed and how the government spends its money. We have a vote on who we send to the central government as well as local government who make those laws and spend that money on our behalf. And I put that in quotation marks because often the government does things that are extremely unpopular, particularly at least here in the U.S. So, I mean, I live in Bellefonte in Centre County, Pennsylvania, in the U.S. I get to vote for local officials. I get to vote for some state officials. I get to vote for my senators from Pennsylvania. I get to vote for my representative for the 15th district, I believe. Fuck Glenn Thompson. He's garbage and should not be elected to office, but he keeps getting back in. On a side note. And I get to vote for the President of the United States. What I don't get to do is cast a vote on laws that are proposed, unless the ballot initiative, which I actually don't think Pennsylvania really does much of. Some states do much more of it. But I don't get to vote on the laws that are passed, and I don't really get to vote on how tax money is spent. The best that I can do is hope that the person that I cast my ballot for will align with my interests, desires, objectives, etc. And often that simply isn't the case. And there's nothing I can do about that. Right? If I vote for X candidate because I agree with them on A, B, and C issues, but I disagree with them on D issue, they're still going to vote on D issue the way that they would vote on it, because my vote for them does not tell them I support you on A, B, and C issue, but I want you to do something different on D. So representative democracy or liberal democracy doesn't entirely function the way that Deary claims it does. Nor is this an entirely accurate representation of ancient Greek democracy, or ancient Athenian democracy more accurately, because in ancient Greece, democracy emerges around the start of the 5th century BCE, late 6th century BCE, early 5th century BCE, and it goes really sort of through the 4th century BCE. There's sort of interruptions and whatnot. But across the Greek-speaking world as a whole, there was a wide range of different types of democracies with different rules, different guidelines, etc., etc. Today, we tend to think about Greek democracy as Athenian democracy, in part because Athens was the largest and most influential of the Greek democratic city-states, and in part because Athens is the one that we know the most about, because they were the largest and most influential. But other Greek city-states had versions of democracy that diverged from what Athens did in primarily the 5th century BCE. What Deary leaves out, that's the really major difference between contemporary representative democracy and Greek democracy, is that in Athens, they had direct democracy, which means citizens actually had a vote on what laws got passed and how tax money was spent. They served on juries in which they decided guilt or innocence by popular vote, etc., etc. So that's a substantial difference that Deary, because I don't know that he wants to devote a tremendous amount of time to this, which is why it gets one page, but it is actually a substantial distinction, right? Today, we don't actually get to have a direct say on how power is exercised within representative democracies, but we have a much broader franchise than the ancient Athenians had, because they had a comparatively small number of people, possibly 20 to 30% of the total population of Athens who were legally eligible to vote. But they wielded direct power over these issues. So if a question was raised about, say, how should we tax this commodity, we've found a ton of silver, one might almost say a boatload of silver. Should we use that profits from that to build a giant defensive wall, or should we use it to build a really awesome navy? The citizens got to directly decide that. Whereas today, if, say, the United States found a ton of silver, by the way, the reason the boatload thing works is because they did choose to strengthen their navy. But today, if the United States found a ton of silver, I, as a citizen of the United States, would have virtually no say in what happened with that. Like, they simply wouldn't ask me. There's no mechanism for asking me. So that's a sort of interesting element, to me, at least. But there's also a lot of other stuff that Deary talks about, like Greek inventions, like the pinhole camera. And one of the things that, again, is really cool about the Horrible Histories series is that it engages with readers, right? So Deary doesn't just explain the pinhole camera, he gives instructions to make your own version of one. So I don't think I ever did this as a kid, but it's the kind of thing that as a kid you could do and say, okay, that's fun. I've learned something. I have kinesthetically engaged with this knowledge. We get, as always, information about the role of women in Greek society, and in particular in different Greek societies, right? The role of women in Athens was quite different from the role of women in Sparta, for instance. And these are really the big two that, when people talk in general about ancient Greece, that we tend to focus on, Athens and Sparta. And the roles of women were quite different in them. The roles of women in Greek mythology were really varied depending on which myth it was and what the woman's status was, etc., etc. So you do get all these sort of variations. You also get Groovy Greeks Grizzly Quiz in this edition, which again is another sort of cool thing that children can participate in. There's bits where it encourages you to test your teacher, etc., etc. And so all of that, again, is really about using the rhetorical tools available to engage readers with history, to encourage children, students, whatever it is, to take an active role in understanding this historical material and trying to sort of trying to really internalize this knowledge. So I think that's very, very cool. And again, across the board, Deary does it really, really well with the Horrible Histories series. The other thing that he does in this book in particular is the last actual portion, the epilogue, really focuses on the transition from Greek civilization to Roman civilization, because ancient Greece, to the extent that it was ever a unified, singular construct, which it really wasn't. That's something we kind of impose on it today in the service of constructing a historical narrative that makes sense to us. But to the extent that there was a Greek world, that there was a Greek civilization as such, it was superseded when Greece was conquered by Rome, or the Greek city-states were conquered by Rome. And one of the things that is striking and important about that within the structure of Groovy Greeks is that's the bit at the end of a horror movie, right? Where like it says the end, and then the letters turn all bloody and a question mark appears, right? That's the bit where it's basically saying, hey, be on the lookout for the next Horrible Histories book, which happens to be Rotten Romans, right? So, I mean, Deary is clearly sort of situating this book within a teleology of world history in which the Romans are the subsequent great civilization of Europe, or Southern Europe, at the very least.